Welcome everybody to week 3 on our seminar series this term. It's my great pleasure to introduce Anna Nasser. I'll introduce Natalya in a second. She's our Deacon Fellow for the year in French Studies. I'm really pleased to have her. She's a historian of modern Europe and European Empire. She received her DPhil from the University of Naples years ago. She in a PhD in global history and governance. Her current research is on women's organizations in the process of decolonization, broadly conceived, mostly on West Africa and France. And she's author of a number of important articles, and she's working with a much larger book project. We're going to hear, I think, hopefully quite a bit about that tonight. Then we have, of course, Natalya Vince, who's a member of the history faculty based at UNIV. She's the author of 2 books, one published in 2015 on Our Fighting Sisters, which is about women's involvement in the Algerian War, which won a prize. And also her second book was published in 2020 on the Algerian War and Algerian Revolution, which is an effort to think about memory in kind of local, national, and transnational context. So it goes all the way up to 2019, I think, for that second book. And she's now working on a much bigger project about kind of students and their kind of their memories from the Algerian War onward. Okay, so we'll have Anna will speak for about 45 minutes, and then Natalya will come in for 10, 12-minute comment, and we'll just open up to the audience after that. So welcome both of you. Great to have you here. And Anna, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. I want to start thanking Paul and Antony for having me at the Center of European Studies, and also Natalya for taking the time to discuss this with me and more generally with us today. As Paul was telling, I'm actually presenting one part of this manuscript work that I'm doing, and it's a part on networks. As you can see from the lovely title of the talk today, which is Organizing Across the Imperial and the Global Space, Women's Organization and Networks at the End of the French Empire. And so, as the title suggests, my interest on women's organization at a certain point got really directed to their networks and what it means for them to create a network, how these networks were created and which connections and how they were fostered, and especially how they organize across space, that of the empire, and also across time, as in decolonization, knowing that organizing nationally is something really different than organizing at least across the Mediterranean Sea, in the case of reaching Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, and even farther when it's a matter of French West Africa and global exchanges and networks. So, yes. A few basic points before we begin. The 2 organizations that I've been actually working on actually managed to create networks and organizational structures within the space of the empire. And especially in a moment that starting from 1946, when there was a general reorganization of what an empire means and how France was to continue to be an empire after the Second World War. The 2 main actors of this story that I will be speaking about today are both of them are French organizations. The first one is called Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, or Women's Association of the Women of the French Union. And then it developed branches in French West Africa as elsewhere, but I'm going to focus on French West Africa. And the second organization is the Union des Femmes Françaises, which developed contacts but not branches in Africa. And it was mostly connected with communist and leftist networks in the Cold War. So to create these exchanges, whether contacts or organizational structures, both organizations developed their own organizational network as well as engage with other networks. So I'm going to be talking about the 2 of them. And just to oversimplify, so it kind of gives you an idea of where this organization stands more generally, we can say that Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, which is the one in the first picture, that's a branch from Porto Novo, Dahomey, of the organization, was more a pro-imperial and liberal women's group. And the other one, as you can see down, and you can recognize the really communist leftist style of the Cold War congresses, was Union des Femmes Françaises, which was more into this anti-colonial communist network, as I was saying. So why to look at them in this way? Because I think they can be understood as mechanics and infrastructures for organization across the empire, and especially at the time of the colonization. And what I mean by this, it's that actually what I'm trying to suggest in the book, and especially in this part, is that while announcing, connections with women from French West Africa specifically, but the empire in general, and engaging with different groups, not only women's groups, but also mixed groups, as in communist, galaxy, and structures, what they actually did was creating the infrastructure in which anti-colonial struggle for women's rights could be carried out at different levels of the empires. I know that speaking of networks in a room full of political scientists, it's a tricky matter, because I think all of you are thinking, whoa, network analysis? Not really. I would like to propose this as a qualitative and imprecise network analysis, but I'm really looking forward to know what you think about it. But for me, it's something that has been crucial in the process, working on this part of the book and also during the PhD, to try to look at this network, this women's organization, both as organization and network. So that already, I think, mixes up a bit the definition of network that I'm trying to use. And also to do so from below, because indeed, both these organizations were also engaging with international women's organizations and structures, the International Council of Women and the Women's International Democratic Federation, respectively. But for me, looking at it from below really meant trying to understand how the network was created. And especially not focusing only on congresses, as the one you can see there, which oftentimes in the history of women's organization are considered the moment in which people get in touch and directly connect, but looking at all the process before. So trying to understand how the participation of women from French West Africa and more generally from the empire was actually made possible by previous contacts of different types that this organization developed. And also, although when I'm speaking about a communist, in brackets, network, I think that looking at it from below also helps us to decenter Cold War histories. I will not speak about the United States. I will mention the Soviet Union every now and then, but for me, it was really a way to kind of get out of the dichotomous idea that everything is based on rivalries between the USSR and the United States. So, as I was telling you, while preparing this, even during the PhD, I started to question what is a network? And what do I mean as a network when especially I'm looking at both networks that are in a certain way less organized, more fluid, more volatile as well. And when I'm looking at them in connection with organizations that are structured. And supposedly they work through specific norms and behaviors that are enforced through the structure, right? And so when we look at it from historical perspective and in historical research, we see there has been a huge interest in networks since the early 2000s. I think it's fair to say that already 20 years ago, almost, Claire Lemercier, who was an historian of France, actually, in a piece in 2005, she said, the word network is everywhere. And it's true that historians have started to pick up, especially from sociologists and political scientists, the question of what is a network and how do we research it. And especially in the field of the history of empire, but also global history more generally, there has been quite a lively exchange about how we look at networks and what we do with them. And some even suggested to move beyond the idea of network, especially some have described connections as imperial clouds, especially in empires, so moving away from the idea of network, but taking that down the idea of a cloud, as in the internet. Others, as Jürgen Osterhammer, have been speaking, for instance, of interaction areas. So while I was doing this, and because of the nature of this organization, and trying not to impose a definition from the top, I realized that none of this definition, and the definition of network is probably necessary but not enough when speaking about the organization of women I'm looking at. For two reasons, mainly. The first one is these organizations had a structure, so they had one organizational structure that it was a structure, and at the same time they engage in a plurality of networks in the hope to stabilize them, institutionalize them, and then create branches, especially in the overseas. So it was a double movement that I could see, them engaging in network and as networks. Some historians of the WIDF have actually spoken of it as a network making space, but also keeping in mind that they were aiming for something different than just conflict. So to do so, I was actually trying to identify which types of connection this organization created, especially in their attempt to reach different spaces in the French Empire. And this is kind of simplifying it because the type of networks they used were either informal, and so it means personal contact, kinship, familial ties that they exploited, or they were formal. And this, by formal, I mean interacting with structured bodies. For instance, the state-related network is in administrative, and by this I mean the relation with different ministries within the French state, whether the Ministry of Colonial Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so also diplomatic networks in that part. Political and party-related, meaning the relationship that they could build because of their participation in specific political parties, which were for the Union des Femmes Françaises, the French Communist Party indeed, and for the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, both the Socialist Party, especially the SPO, the Section Française de l'Internationale ouvrière, and the Mouvement Républicain Populaire, so the Christian Democrats of France. And by political, I also looked at the ties with similar organizations. So in the case of Union des Femmes Françaises, what were the political ties that they also had, as we will discuss later, ties with other mass organizations within the system, meaning trade unions, youth organization groups, and so on and so forth. And the last one, it's the organizational ties, meaning how the structure of the organization spreads. So just to give you, we can start with this, yes. So the personal type of connection. As I was telling you, you've seen the connections are different, and I try to divide them into formal and informal. Starting with the informal one, as I was telling you, those were based on personal contact and kinship, and also on ideological similarities. For instance, for the liberal group, and so the pro-imperial Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, also ideological similarities with Christian Democrats and Christian missionaries and more general imperial reformers who sought to develop social policies for reform in the empire at the time of the colonization. And in some cases, these very contacts became extremely formalized and supported the stabilization of local organizational structure everywhere in the empire, and also enforced support for them. And one really clear example that I put there is that this kind of personal network that some individuals had was also the basis for the creation of the various Associations des Femmes de l'Union Française. And you can see here, that's an archival document of a proposed directing board before the organization even existed, that was actually based on pre-existing networks and contacts among women who had been active in the French Empire before the war, for instance. This never came into being, but it gives an idea of how personal connections, especially of the founder of this organization, were used to think of a process of institutionalization and structuring of the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française. And also personal networks could be mobilized in the overseas territories. And so just to mention too, it was personal network were the basis of how the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française actually went to colonial administrators in Senegal, in French Sudan, in Côte d'Ivoire, and attempted actually to engage them in supporting the organization locally of their association. And this personal network was extremely widespread, just to mention two individuals, which I think make us understand how this organization was connected personally at an individual level with the French state. The socialist Marius Moutet, who was the Minister of Overseas France, was actually the husband of one of the women of this organization, something which was used by the organization to pursue support from the Ministry of Overseas France. And similarly, Gaston Monnerville from French Guiana, who was the president of the Council of the Republic, the Senate version of in the French Republic, in the Fourth French Republic, was also connected to the organization because his wife was part of it. So this kind of familial and personal relationship were really exploited, and they were also, used to pursue the goals of the organization. But something else when we look at personal relationships is that many relationships were also constructed and built by chance by this organization. What I put here, it's a document that it's not from the French archives, but it's from the National Archives of Great Britain, because at a certain point, the wives of British diplomats in Paris are invited by the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française in 1949 to join them for a tea while their husbands are watching a movie. And when they come back to that's actually what happened. I think it's written there. And what happens is when they come back to Great Britain, they actually write to Mrs. Creech Jones, who was the wife of Arthur Creech Jones, at the time Secretary of the State for the Colonies, if I'm not getting wrong the British structure, suggesting to create a similar women's organization for the wives of colonial officials. And that meeting was completely by chance and based on personal exchanges that were created elsewhere. So if that was the case for the liberal ones, what happens about personal exchanges and personal connections for the communist ones? Indeed, they were critical. Also, in the case of Union des Femmes Françaises, there has been much research on the communist family, as it was probably discussed a few years ago in sociological terms when looking at the activism and the militantism of members of the French Communist Party and their companions and their partners and their families. But this personal connection worked extremely well in the connections between the Union des Femmes Françaises and local African women, especially as the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, which was the political party connected to the PCF until 1951, that was stable in French West Africa and a bit in French Equatorial Africa, was directly promoting political engagement through personal networks and networks of kinship. For instance, directly claiming, and I'm quoting, to the militants to bring your wife and sisters to the women's groups. It should be noted, though, I was speaking of wives of, husbands of before, that if this was the way in which these connections were described, especially in liberal and bourgeois networks, it wasn't the same in communist and leftist one. Indeed, the leading figures of the Union des Femmes Françaises, while some of them were in specific familial relationship with major members of the Communist Party. One among them, Juliette Dermetsch, was actually the partner, not the wife, of Maurice Doré, who was the secretary of the French Communist Party. They do not present themselves as the wives of. You can see already different political approaches here. But so what did they do with personal networks? So these personal networks, as I was telling you, were then oftentimes supported or intersected with formal type of networks. And just to be really brief about it, there are administrational networks. And just to make one example that I think kind of gives also the idea of the different ways in which these two organizations attempted to create connections in the empire. When I think of organizational administrational networks, I think especially on the possibility of specific group to go to any public administration of the state and demand support, which was indeed the case of the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française because of their apolitical position, or what they claim to be apolitical, and also because of the shared aims with the French administration for what concerned post-war imperial politics. And therefore, it's not uncommon to see in the archives directly the women from Paris writing to colonial governments in Côte d'Ivoire, in Dakar, in Bamako, presenting themselves as a colonial organization supported by the state and asking, for instance, for money directly. This indeed was a luxury that the Union des Femmes Françaises, on the other hand, could not have. The French Communist Party was indeed out of government since the late 1947. And since then, the organization, as the party, took a really antagonistic and oppositional stance to the French government in general. Although at the beginning, something interesting that I found, and I think I put it there, this kind of administrative support had been actually pursued by the Union des Femmes Françaises, especially at the beginning of in their first meetings. And you can see here, this is a document of this one up here. This is a document actually going to the gouvernement in Algeria and suggesting that they find a way to get Algerian women support so they could come to the first Congress of the Union des Femmes Françaises in 1945. But the real difference here is that through the participation in administrative bodies, and for instance, some of the women in the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française were also part of the administration, meaning that they were, for instance, member of the diplomatic services. Some of them were representing France at the United Nations. This was a way for them to enlarge their networks and their connections with other women's group on the one hand, but also with other imperial reformers. At the same time, they were also participating because of their support of governmental policy into specific commissions within the French state that were discussing relevant matters to them. For instance, education for girls and women's rights in colonial territories more generally. But it's especially when moving towards across the Mediterranean and into French West Africa that this administrational connection was what really made them, have the chance to create organizational branches, and so to move from an administrational network into organizational structure. And this is something that we see because of their connection with colonial governments and their exchanges, but also we see it in the way in which sometimes it didn't work. So just to take an example, I don't think I put it there. One of the examples of how this connection worked was that the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française would write to the local government and suggest that they wanted to create the organization. They would try to engage the wives of colonial governors as well. And they would try to engage local African women, especially the ones participating in the administration locally, which meant stenographer, nurses, social assistants, and social worker more generally. Now, this worked pretty well with the exception that sometimes it had paradoxical effects. So, for instance, in Bamako, French Sudan, right now Mali, what happened is that these exchanges were crucial indeed with the administration to gain access to African women locally, which otherwise would have not probably even met these French women. But at the same time, the paradoxical effect was that instead of leading to the creation of a local branch, as it would have been the idea for the organization, the work of the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française was actually subsumed within the one of the administration and within the social services. And so because of the attempt to actually engage someone that was already so embedded within the French organization, the very same Association des Femmes de l'Union Française basically disappeared from that territory and became only considered as a place where friendly women were active, but not as a branch. And obviously, the other is the political. So the political connection, as I was telling you, probably it's more relevant in the case of the Union des Femmes Françaises and the relationship with the French Communist Party. Not because there were no relationship with the SPO of the MRP. Two members of the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française were actually deputies and senators of those parties, but I wasn't able to retrace any connection, or I haven't seen them using those connections in order to pursue the organization. So it's clear that it's completely different from the way in which Union des Femmes Françaises work because of the isolation of the French Communist Party, and because of how these kind of party-led connections worked. And the interesting thing with them is that these kind of political connections were the only thing that they actually put in place when going towards the colonial territories, beyond obviously some personal contacts they established. What I mean by this is that when we look at the structure, of the French Communist Party and where the Union des Femmes Françaises was, it was really integrated within this broader galaxy or nebula. It's been called in different ways by historians, which connected it with other communist parties on the one hand, through the work of the French Communist Party, other mass organizations, so as I said before, trade unions and youth organizations. And while in the rest of the empire, the Union des Femmes Françaises did not have branches that had kind of sister organizations, the Union des Femmes de l'Algérie, Union des Femmes du Maroc, Union des Femmes de la Tunisie, and they also had them in the department of the French Empire. So basically the Caribbeans and La Réunion Island, close down from Madagascar, so different sides of the extension of the French Empire. When we look at what happened in French West Africa, we don't see any reproduction of the Union des Femmes model there. Why so? For two reasons. Main reason, there were no official communist parties in French West Africa because of politics both of the Comintern, but also of the PCF of the post-war years. And therefore, the issue was that this Union des Femmes Françaises group had to try to connect with French West Africa without using this connection, without moving across the party network. And then we can talk maybe more about the question of Algeria, because I think it's really unclear whether they understood specific Union Française as colonial and imperial branches of themselves or not. For this reason, I put here these sources, which is actually from the bulletin of the WIDF, where you can see that under France, there are, for instance, the department and the Union des Femmes de la Guadeloupe and Union des Femmes de la Martinique, not Algeria. But so as you can see, it tried to move across party-related connections, but with the difficulty that sometimes no party connections were there. So how did they do it? They do it through a completely different way, which is actually the last type of connection. Oh, no, sorry. Yes, I wanted to show you what is the expansion at a certain point. And then to give you an idea, I can go back here. But I was telling you they did it through another way, meaning that they didn't interact with French West African women through the connection of the party, or they attempted to do so, but with the limits of having to go through the French Communist Party and through the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, which was the anti-colonial party connected to it. But they also tried to do it through international organizations. And international organizations, I mean, for instance, and I mentioned it here, the WIDF, which was, yes, the international part of the UFF, because indeed, both organizations, the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française and Union des Femmes Françaises, were inserted within these larger organizational networks. So they, for instance, worked not through contact, but through formal affiliation, which kinds of gives us a bit more structure to recover the connections. And if the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française was affiliated with the International Council of Women through the National Council of French Women, this did not have many effects when it came to reaching out of the empire because of the politics of the International Council of Women towards colonial territories, meaning leading to the national branches to decide how to approach them. As they were not independent, it was working through national ideas and representation of nationalities, and colonies were not considered full nationals. It is more interesting, though, how the Union des Femmes Françaises and the Women's International Democratic Federation worked together to try to reach to French West Africa. And it was extremely complex, also because of the disconnection I was telling you about with the lack of communist parties in there. But it was extremely complex also because they were trying not to reproduce an imperial setting and thus creating imperial branches in there. Just to show you this was the expansion. I wanted to try to show you how these networks look like. You can see my artistic capabilities here, but this is kind of what I'm working on. And you can see that there are organizational, administrational, political, and personal links. And sometimes they do interact. This is for the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, especially between 1946, when it was created, and I would say the middle of 1950s. And the other one, as you can see, this is way more political connection, as I was telling you. So, how could they do it? Something else that connects the two organizations is that they were able not only to use this way of getting in touch and contact or use the organizational structures, but also exploit other networks to reach to French West Africa. Because indeed, both organizations, l'Association des femmes de l'Union française and the Union des femmes françaises, had the interest, were interested in reaching women from colonial, semi-colonial, and independent territories. And for instance, the Association des femmes de l'Union française exploited the networks forged by other locally in the overseas territories, were there Christian missions, were there reformers. And among them, especially the Red Cross and the role. If I put it there, yes, I did actually, because in certain territories, the Red Cross, which was way more stable and organized and more widespread than the Association des femmes de l'Union française, was either cooperating with these women that reached there, or sometimes it was competing with it. And when we look at their interaction, what we see is that many women affiliated with the Red Cross were also affiliated with the Association des femmes de l'Union française, so the liberal ones. And we can see in some cases, and I put you here the case of Dakar, which I think is specifically striking because of the also the social density of groups and political parties in Senegal, which was completely different from other territories of the French Union and French West Africa. There, for instance, something interesting happens. Supposedly, there was an Association des femmes de l'Union française group since 1946. This group completely disappears, but it reappears in communication, reaching out to women that are active in the Red Cross. And this is a case of a young girl who actually got a scholarship. She's originally from French Guinea, but then she grew up in French Sudan. So there is already this movement, which is interesting. She gets one of the scholarship of the Association des femmes de l'Union française that was, created and given out to have young African girls come to the metropole and as France to study and become social workers. And she gets this scholarship, and then for some reason she's stuck in France without finishing her degree. And what happens is that a certain Madame Germain, that it's mentioned in this letter, from the Association des femmes de l'Union française, comes, rescues her, gets her into one of the degrees that the Red Cross was carrying out in France, and then brings her back to work as a social worker in Dakar a few years later. And it's interesting because at a certain point, there are this plurality of affiliation of specific individuals that the organization can play to reach out and find a way to sustain their aims. Hence, having this girl finishing her degree and go back to her territory to serve as a social worker. This plurality of affiliation yet was not shared among the two organizations. The network of the Union des femmes françaises was way less willing to cooperate at the national level with other organizations. This is different, for instance, in the local level, where Christian women and socialist women were involved, or in bigger networks such as the World Council of Peace, where also intellectuals and non-communist intellectuals would participate. But also the Union des femmes françaises had to rely on other networks, and they did so especially using and exploiting the connections that other mass organizations had. Even more so after 1951, when the Women's International Democratic Federation, the World Federation of Trade Unions, and the World Federation of Democratic Youth get banned from France and the French Empire as foreign organization, and hence they moved the headquarters to Prague, to Berlin, and elsewhere. It became way harder for them to reach out. Because of this, and because around the 1950s, there was a split between the PSF and this anti-colonial political party active in French West Africa. Hence, we see that they tried to continue engaging women that they had met, either through personal connections, and we go back kind of to the first slide, or through national mass organization. So the CGT, the General Trade Union Federation, I think that's a translation in English, And in this way, they continue actually to send in letters and to keep at least the contact that they had with these women. So if this is how this network worked concretely, what I was also interested in looking at, and I think I pointed out a bit talking about the Union de France Française, it's also the possibility and constraints that came with this organization, with the networks they were in, and with their organizational structure. Because if both of them managed to create context in the overseas territories, they did so in different ways, indeed, because of their ideological and organizational setup, but they also did so because of their understanding of whether the space of the empire was their space of engagement or not. And also, while networks, and especially other networks, were useful to extend and engage and reach the empire, they also come with specific limitations because they frame certain connections and they obscure other and possibility for others, but also they impose specific codes of behavior, of engagement, and of connection. And in this sense, it's true that formal, informal, and personal network were in a certain way freer and more, but they were also more volatile. And so they needed to be reinforced through formal networks. But so when I was looking at the constraints that this organization had, actually, I realized that it was really the issue of how they built the empire that shaped the way in which they tried to reach the territory and especially engage locally in these territories. And for instance, the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, also through the name, which is really self-declaring, believed that the empire was its first and major territory of expansion. Its aim was to be a trait d'union, so a connecting link between France, the metropole, and the colonies after the disruption that the war had created. And so the organization actually gave priority to enhance that connection, to create branches and not only contacts. And it did so without really involving its international structure, meaning the Conseil National des Femmes and the International Council of Women. Yet it also faces certain limitations because as it was attempting to engage middle-class women and educated women, depending on the territories and the development of educational services and system, it was either harder or easier actually to reach out to local African women that met the criteria they supposedly had. Also for the Union de France Française, the question of the empire was an issue. As I was saying before, the empire was a bit of a conundrum because on the one hand, it was seen as a necessary space of engagement for global revolution and especially anti-colonial, anti-imperial revolution. But on the other hand, the main issue was how to engage in the empire without reiterating specific imperial settings and logics. And this is why also they never tried, even when they had connections with French West African women, to create local Union Française, local women's union in French West Africa, as they did before, for instance, in other territories. Another issue that they had, which was connected to how they viewed the empire, and also how they engaged with the Women's International Democratic Federation, it was that political engagement was considered as well as a matter of representing specific nationalities and nations. And this did not only cover the political engagement, but also the way in which anti-colonial movements and revolutionary movements were considered. So, for instance, the Union de Femmes Françaises had no issue in defining that there was a Spanish, a Greek, a Vietnamese, a Malgache, and so for Madagascar issue to be solved, colonial issue to be solved, but they really struggled to identify it as one of Senegal or French West Africa because of the way in which anti-colonial stances were brought forward. And in this case, has national liberation movements. And this was something that obviously impeded them to reach out to French West African women up to a certain point because they couldn't frame them within a specific geography that was also reproduced and enforced at the international level. One last element of constraints for the Union de France Française, it was for sure, and I think this is common when looking at communist parties, the process of compartmentalization of the politics of the French Communist Party, meaning one thing was working on women and one thing was working on the colonies. And for this, there was a specific colonial section. So what happens at the end of the empire? The things I said up until this moment were for sure true up until the mid-1950s. By the mid-1950s, then, these networks change and they also have different futures and they change both in nature and form. The organizational structure that the Association des Femmes Françaises had established was almost completely disappearing because of imperial changes in the way in which activism within the empire was taught, and they basically had lost all their centrality within the French administration. It was a time in which the evolution of power was given to African territories, and within 2 years, in 1958, they would become republics. What remained for them were personal contacts that were actually by then exploited by their international structure. So the International Council of Women, that by the end of the 1950s becomes more and more interest in underdeveloped countries, how were defined the former colonies or colonies of the French Union and the French community. And hence there is this process in which the international organization actually gets the contacts previously there of a previous network, actually a previous organization, and uses them to enforce specific participation in a wide array of activities that could have gone from participation in international seminar as proposed by the UNESCO until contributing to documents on the condition of African women that could be used in international institutions, up until creating National Council of Women. And the document that I put there, it's actually an exchange between the president of the SW, who had been a woman of the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, who's basically telling a secretary to reach out to these African women that she had met as a woman of the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, to call them up to participate in these international meetings. And this is how it changed, for instance, to give you an idea. So you can see that it's becoming way less stable in the connection with the African Women's Group, and everything is going through the International Council of Women. But the time, this is the WIDF, because indeed a similar process was taking place also within communist organizations. And as you can see, since the mid-1950s, also because of the Algerian War, the Union des Femmes Françaises was taking a step back from directly engaging with African women in French West Africa. They continue to support them financially, for instance, but this communication went directly through the Women's International Democratic Federation, reached out to this women's organization that had become autonomous in the meantime, and asking them to participate in specific networks, also through the help of other mass organizations. But something else happens within the leftist anti-colonial network. First of all, there is a process of regionalization of the organization. We see that in the WIDF between the late 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, because of the growth of African Women's Group and women also from Asia and Latin America, they start to regionalize the network, which means, and this is what I put here, their coordinating committee starts to have meetings first in Jakarta in 1960 and then in Bamako in 1962, with the aim actually to get women from these continents on board. It had started before in Latin America, where they already were independent states since 1954, and this is a process that it's announced because of the massive participation of these women. Something else that we see at the end of the empire, especially when looking at it from how African Women's Group engage with this organization, it's a form of pluralization of their networks. If before they were also uncadred, I would say, within this liberal and leftist network, um, with the growth of their autonomy, they become more widespread, which meant that they start participating in international organization meetings, but they also start participating in Catholic and Christian women's meeting. They participate still within the ICW and the WIDF, but they also start to create other networks, such as different Pan-African networks that they self-organize and Afro-Asian networks. And this is something that it's extremely considered by the International Council of Women and the WIDF because they want to know what is going on in these new connections and actually cut them out, as they are organizations that are still embedded in Europe. And this is what it looks like when we look at it from the side of African women. And I'm going towards the conclusion. So what I'm trying to show, and if it doesn't make much sense, please let me know, because I really hope it does, is that these organizations, first of all, they were able to reach out to the empire, and they did so in different ways and with different connections, and also with different outcomes at a certain point. But for me, this shows, and the way in which they engage with networks, this shows not only that they were agents of the empire or of the colonization, but also agents of a plurality of forms of internationalism and internationalization as well as processes, whether colonial, anti-colonial, or more differentiated ones that also challenge top-down approaches. I consider them as organizations that, yes, were mechanics for reaching out to the empire, but were also really producing the imperial and the international into existence by their activism, by creating these connections and these exchanges, whether they became actually organizational structures or they stayed as contacts to enhance anti-colonial politics, for instance. And I speak here of the imperial and the international because, as this network shows, I think, and it's clear when we look at networks instead of the empire as a prefix category, is that the imperial and the empire is something that exceeded itself. They try to connect, especially different experiences in different empires. That's why you had the documents from the National Archives of Great Britain. These networks exceeded the imperial space. And they did so in a way that also brought forward conflicts, and it wasn't always smooth. One example, it's the conflict within the WIDF that the presence of African women brings forward. And that's why they regionalize. At a certain point, they have, for instance, in a meeting in 1958, out of 34 participants, 14 who are from Africa, considering also North Africa. And what I mean by these exchanges, they were not smooth, but they also brought conflict. It's because they also challenge the hierarchies and ideologies within the two main networks. So pro-imperial in general, considering also the French state in this, and anti-colonial and communist one, considering also the Soviet Union in this. It's clear by the end of the 50s, the Sino-Soviet split is just around the corner, and African women have a role in this. But lastly, as I hope to have seen, is that to have shown today, is that it's not only an issue of connection when looking at networks, but also of disconnection and what is missing. What are the constraints? How are they forced to work in a specific way? And something more generally that I would love to push forward in this part of the manuscript is that when we actually take out the reading glasses of the Cold War, there is much more that we see about mass organization, who have been considered for long as chains of communication directly coming from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but also as a way to relook at not only imperial history, but a Cold War history generally and European history specifically. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, it's great to hear this paper because decolonisation has long been told as a history of men. So we have male nationalist leaders, we have, male presidents and prime ministers in imperial powers, we have male generals and soldiers in European armies, we have male nationalist fighters, and actually women for a long time only visible if they do something that's basically considered to be unwomanly, like participate in acts of violence. So why is it, and that explains why the most famous sort of women from Algerian independence are women who fought bombs. And many of you will have seen the film The Battle of Algiers, and you will have noticed that actually those women fought bombs, but they never get a speaking role, right? So we don't ever hear very much about women's political opinions. They are sort of amassed to be mobilised by men in favour of the nationalist cause. I was rereading actually just at the weekend the diary of Faye Hussein, who was 17 years old when she was condemned to death for planting a bomb in Algiers. And something that really comes through in that are the political differences of the women alongside whom she is in prison. And she really talks about that a lot, and it's something that has been lost from historiography. So I think sort of what you're getting at, Anna, is that by sort of focusing on women's organisations and women's political activities, we can see a different story of decolonisation. And of course, much of that is building on the literature which emerged in the 1990s, sort of about imperial feminism, firstly in the British Empire, and then that's been picked up by historians of all empires. And the ways in which women's organised in the late 19th and early 20th century, and in particular women from France and Britain, both reinforced and undermined imperial understandings of class, race and gender. So they're doing something quite complicated in that sense. And both imperialism and resistance to it and sort of male-dominated political culture and women's resistance to it, all of that taken together is producing this sort of new political culture. And all of those questions are now kind of being asked sort of the period of decolonisation, not least because women are so central to strategies in the mid-20th century of hearts and minds, right, which are strategies both of colonial powers and nationalist movements. So another actually memoir that I was rereading at the weekend were the memoirs of someone called Suzanne Massu, who was also a wife of, but she is quite an important figure in her own right. She's actually the wife of General Massu, who leads the big repression in Algiers in 1956-67. And her trajectory is super interesting. So she is a member of the Free French during the Second World War. Then she goes to Indochina, and then she goes to Algeria. And when she's in Algeria, she sets up what we call sort of women's friendship communities, right? And the idea is that actually women are particularly well suited to sort of winning over hearts and minds. That Algerian women are more susceptible than Algerian men to this sort of, message. 20 years previously, it might have been called the civilizing mission. Now it's the modernizing mission. And sort of through women, men are going to be sort of civilized and brought into a sort of revived version of the French state and society. But she's a very sort of messy and complicated figure. And a lot of the things that she does are actually often not really working in the interests of the French state. And this drive that she has, sort of looking after orphans and sort of building friendship between women is not necessarily in the military interests of what French army is seeking to achieve. And kind of sort of from that, I had sort of a few questions for you. So you sort of set up a bit of a dichotomy, which you then complicated towards the end, between, on the one hand, this sort of liberal colonial organisation, on the other hand, this communist anti-colonial one. And I think it's definitely sort of not as clear cut as that, and the organising itself doesn't really reflect that, in the sense that, French communists are not in favour of getting rid of the empire in the 1920s, 30s, maybe a bit in the 1920s, but not in the 30s, the 40s, or indeed even right up until the late sort of 1950s. So individual people within the Algerian Communists or the French Communist Party might be quite anti-colonial, but that's not actually the official sort of party position. And of course, the person who grants independence, both in sub-Saharan Africa and in Nigeria, is de Gaulle, right? He was a right-wing politician. And so there's this sort of Republican enthusiasm for empire that you do find amongst a lot of people in the Socialist and the Communist Party. And I also think some of the ways in which they're thinking about women's political activism really resembles each other. So this sort of maternalist rhetoric, the idea that women are going to be social workers and midwives. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about that a little bit more. The other question that you raised was sort of the challenge of operating in a colonial context, right, which has different laws, different possibilities for political organisation, both censorship, but also different cultures in which mixed-sex organisations, it might be actually quite difficult to get women to come along to that in some contexts. And of course, they have to deal with the nationalists, well, which also have their own women's organisations. And one of the really tantalising sort of things that you mentioned were about how international organisations such as the Red Cross sort of cut across those. And is there a sense then that you're kind of challenging certain conventional chronologies through not only the organisations that you're looking at, but sort of a broader constellation, if you like, of international organisations? Because, you know, as you say, that these different possibilities and constraints, because they have to work in certain ways, then that actually has longer term consequences that go well into the post-independence period and don't necessarily respect the rupture of formal independence. And then maybe if I just sort of throw one more question in, and that is about, I suspect you're going to get lots of questions about the network. You had a lot of arrows. And I was very interested in sort of some of the metaphors that scholars have used, you know, the cloud, the galaxy, the nebula. And I guess kind of my question was a more concrete one, really. Is this actually a history from below? Because it seems to me it's a really institutional history of quite middle class people. And kind of tell us a bit more sort of about who are these women, what are their backgrounds, and yeah, what might it mean to say this is actually sort of institutional history of middle class rather than history?
Great, thank you very much. I don't want those questions to be lost. Can you, Anna, briefly just address to say anything you thought is relevant before we open up to
Sure.
practice? Okay.
Thank you. All really valid point. I think you're right regarding the dichotomy of it. I think the introducing African women challenges it, but before they are in two different organizations that think of them as competing. So it's really hard to take it out and also write about the position of French communists about the empire, knowing that probably mass organizations are more willing, because of the networks they have, to challenge the maintenance of the empire rather than the party. Women's group, the Secours Rouge as well, they reach out to Algeria way before the party decides, for instance, what to do. And then Indochina, it's a whole other thing. But yes, that's for sure. It's something that needs to be looked at more. And the materialistic rhetoric as well, I agree. They actually have really similar rhetoric. Some of the weird part is that the liberal ones, pro-imperial ones, they put it on the empire, and the communist one, they put it in France, like in metropolitan France. So they would do exactly the same as asking women to become nurses and social workers, but in France. So there is for sure this community and this general maternalism that it's never questioned. They are, first of all, women who are mothers and wives and so on and so forth. Social history from below. No, this I admit when I was especially writing this, I felt it was becoming a bit too much about the structure than the individuals. And I'm still trying to find a way to make it the social part of it, which is central in other parts of the book manuscript, engage in this. And for me, a way is probably to focusing more on specific women, as you suggested, knowing that they are sometimes they do not fit the time, especially because they do not fit the canon. They come, even when they come from Africa in general, they side with specific parties and not with others. But for me, the main issue, the issues were two. Literature on the Cold War, which is still stuck in the 1970s, on mass organizations, and it's crazy. And especially Sovietologists telling you that there is no connection with Africa before 1956. While there is, or someone needs to explain to me why these women at a certain point, they do everything they can to reach there. If it's not, if those are chains of connection, then it doesn't add up. If they're not, and then especially looking at how practices of late colonial and imperial times get transposed, for instance, into humanitarian work and developmental work. I think those are the main chronological and periodizational issues that I have at the moment. And also how these structures change and stay, because they are really similar to the ones of the colonial processes in the 70s, like in Portugal. And I'll leave it to this, but thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll just go ahead and open it up now. I may have a question, but I'm happy to fold that in. There must be others who are ready to pose a question. Okay, we'll start with Sarah. Organising, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, for the wonderful talk, and thank you, Natalya, for the comments. So that actually, I believe I introduced a lot of interesting elements. Well, the thing that I really think about the topic and about this presentation, and that I've been asking myself throughout while Anna was talking is, okay, women network, fantastic concept, and talking about networks and individuals in the international arena, and how much is what is one of the important elements of discussion today, and I totally agree with that. But when we talk about women's network, we talk about women's network to do what? Essentially, the main thing that I thought was I didn't get from your seminar, and I don't know how important it is in the book, is exactly this. So the sense of, okay, we try to build organizations, but then to do what? And I believe that this is probably the element that should be analyzed a little bit in order to kind of try to find the soul of these networks. And I totally agree with the fact that it's all, when we talk about this today, often we talk about elite networks, and perhaps you want to go into that a little more. So how much at this stage is that really a elite movement, and do you think it changes in your longer chronology? And then I believe that longer chronology is going to be a problem. Like, yeah.
Answer that, yeah.
You want, yeah, sure. So to do what? Yes, that's a missing part of this, actually. But I mean, because I think we talked in another place, but it's true that there is a connection between how they organize and what they want to do, right? So creating an organization on locally, it's because, for instance, as Antony said, they want to create groups with local women to engage them, to create this sort of exchange locally, and to have them work voluntarily in charitable organizations. And I think this is why they have the issue of stabilizing and creating a structure. Whereas the Union des Françaises and the leftists, the issue is mobilizing them, but without creating a specific structure. Mobilizing them means mass demonstrations, which do not really take place in the end in West Africa, but also means having them participating with this wide network of the WIDF. And in general, it's seen as, moving forward global revolution through political engagement. Yes, no, and elite, yes or no? depends where. I think the issue here is that I look at it nationally and regionally, but when we get into the local, also in France, it's not really elitist, right? Well, there are some that are more elitist, but when we look at the Union des Femmes Françaises or the African women that participate in the network in French West Africa, we also have an educated women who do not speak French. So it's not an elite. We have workers, and we have a wide array of non-bourgeois women involved. So I think this is one of the differences between the two that probably needs to be stressed a bit more. But the issue of class, for instance, it's a variable that it's complex, and I haven't really touched it because what is class? What is class in Africa? What is class in Algeria? Especially when you have a colonial setting where even if you're a poor European and you reached French West Africa, you reach Senegal, you reach Dakar, the way in which your class, your social, economic, background changes completely, how it's understood. But yeah, I think, yes, that needs to be said. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, I was going to come in, but I'll let Sangat, please. Yeah.
Oh.
No, please.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't expecting my turn now, but yeah,
Yeah, it's okay.
it's okay. It's okay. I was just polishing my. So, well, great presentation. I really liked it and discussion. The other day I was walking with a friend of mine over Waterloo Bridge, and he told me that bridge was basically constructed by women. It was women's organizations. He told me. I don't know if that's true or not, but that made me think about the connection between women's roles in society and the Second World War. So using that as an excuse, I would like you to reflect more upon, why, about the timing of these organizations after Second World War, just as a way to contextualize a bit further your cases. The second comment is about feminism, because I think it was a discussion, the one who mentioned feminism. I can't recall you having mentioned feminism, right? So as a political scientist, we know that feminism as a political movement, a social movement, became more predominant around the 70s. So how can you trace back, in a way, these movements to these networks? Were these networks, in a way, the seeds of what later became, in those places, actual feminist movements? Can you connect it in a way? And the third comment or question is about this idea that so to what extent these networks could have served as a double-edged sword, in the sense that, and you mentioned that when you were talking about class, their presence could have emphasized class divisions if they were populated, these networks, by basically elite, colonial elites, as opposed to local women. In what ways this could have emphasized anti-colonialism, in the sense that you have women who basically are agents of the state, and therefore advocating women's rights was secondary to their action as agents of the state. So I see, these networks overlap with existing divisions, particularly class divisions, and also the anti-colonial, pro-colonial division. So, and I think that the way they may have had an impact may have been very different. In some cases, maybe stressing the division. In some other cases, maybe blurring it. So, I would like you to reflect more upon these, contradictions of these movements.
Thank you, Sandra. No, I agree, especially on how to set these movements more into the post-Second World War setting of Europe, especially Europe and Africa, right? And I mean, they are the outcome of that time. They are the outcome of trying to recreate. I mean, they had also longer legacies. It's clear when we look at, imperial feminism that was mentioned before, from the 20s on. But at the same time, they were the outcome of the post-war situation, meaning that there was really this idea of creating connection was already, for some of them, the main part after the war, trying to recreate these exchanges. And when we look at it, friendship, and sorority. Those are words that we hear almost everywhere in Europe in the early post-war. Friendship train of the US connected to the Marshall Plan, and also from really different ideological positions. And it is also a way, I think, to escape what it meant for women to go back after the resistance, and many of them are resistant, have been engaged with that, and to go back to being in their houses. Actually, they are also workers. That's a discourse that we say that women go back in the houses, and 50s and 60s, nothing happens, and the feminist movement is in the 70s. I don't call them feminists. I know also what you think. But that's a narrative of the feminist movement of the 70s. And so I'm not so sure that there is much that gets transferred to the 70s if what we mean is feminist movement focusing on individual liberation, sexual liberation, challenge against authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. Because when I look at it from 70s and the 80s from Senegal, that's complex. What feminist movement? The European feminist movement, the Euro-American one, it's completely different when we look at it from somewhere else. I think what remains is much into this idea of development and women taking care of the social space and the state. And I think also something else that you said made me something that I wanted to say and I didn't. There is a moment in which women become agents of the state. I actually think that, and they put it on the secondary level, women's rights, especially at the end of the empire, when these networks are populated, especially from the side of African states and have a single party system, for instance, those are representing their state. A woman from French Guinea that goes to the WIDF, she's representing French independent Guinea. She's not oppositional in a positional position. So I think this is really important, and thank you for mentioning that because it needs to be brought up more. I don't know if it answered your.
Miriam.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and I loved how you showed us, like how you pictured the network, and that made me think about your idea of the space that you also have in your title, I think, right? Organizing imperial and global space. So I was wondering, what you presented, however, was not so much this global space, but more really the imperial space between like maybe the tension between the national and the imperial. But what I think you're doing, and that would also be my question, is you want to look at how these women organizations acted and used the newly created, maybe supranational space of the United Nations, of new options of political activism, to also bring about something else. So they dealt in the empire and in the colonial sphere, but maybe what you want to show, at least that's how I understood it. So that's my question. What you want to show might maybe be a new kind of politics that evolved after 45 through your specific lens of these women's organizations. But then my next question would be, are they simply, and I think they're not, like spin-offs of, let's say, the Communist Party or some other democratic organization, or are they organizations, do they understand themselves as organizations of their own right? And if so, what would then, that would maybe also go back to Sarah's question. What's their agenda? And how does their agenda differ from, say, you look at church women who work within the imperial sphere, right? So that would be another of these questions. And that's my last one, promise. I would ask you to put the Cold War glasses back on, because I'm wondering whether they give a different answer to the Cold War, because they are navigating in another sphere as women. Maybe they can communicate on a different level because they're inconspicuously using spheres in this imperial space
which like crosses those strict Cold War barriers. That's a question. I'm not sure whether they do, but as, for example, accepted NGOs at the United Nations, maybe they can't influence. They have much more conversation between them than the Cold War would actually let them have. So if you put onto that those glasses, what different story maybe of the Cold War of political activity than the Cold War.
Thank you. Wow, so much.
Sorry.
No, that's all great. Thank you so much. Let me start from the Cold War glasses. Yes, I mean, the Cold War is still there. It's not that it disappeared, right? But the issue for me is that at a certain point, think about where is the polemic with this? The polemic is global Cold War. Western would basically say, let's just enter the Cold War, and then it basically looks at the two main actors of the Cold War. That is where I get polemic with this. They interact, but in different ways, because Cold War politics is enacted also in the United Nations. WIDF is an A-category organization for the ECOSOC at a certain point between 1947 and then in 1954 she's thrown out. It is thrown out because of Cold War politics. And if you read the meetings of the committee discussing that, it's basically they're communists. So there is also this belief that they were communists and this unapologetic position towards these women that were actually pursuing women's rights, especially in the United States. I think it's interesting what you said in them communicating, because yes, they do, but I don't think they do in the UN. I think they do it on a completely different space. I think the issue is not the institutionalized international through international organisms or institutions, but they do it somewhere else. So for instance, there are moments of opening and moments of closure, right? And at the end of the 50s is a moment of opening when they even think of doing seminars together, something which was impossible before. And or go to Russia to follow a seminar on Soviet women in 56. Yeah, they don't go, but there is a discussion for the ICW on whether to go or whether or not. So for me, it's like when I say how the Cold War lasts, it's because there is much that we haven't seen if we put them on as we did before. But I think the UN is a way to move beyond it. Although when you look at the Status of Women Commission, for instance, there is no possibility of debate, and you really see them aligning constantly. And I mean, Maria Lele for sure is the chair of the CSW, until 53, and she does everything she can to avoid discussion on specific topics. But I think what is interesting is what they do and what are their interests. And I think sometimes there were possibilities of exchange with also Christian international organization. And I'm thinking Christian because it's the ones they mentioned the most in the context of empire. And then in the end, they did not. That I can see that there were possibilities, for instance, on polygamy, on specific forms of violation of the women body, to actually have common discussions. As international organizations, they don't. But I think it's interesting because they try to do it at different levels. So they try to have this conversation in the UN ad hoc committee on slavery, and Christian and women's organizations are crucial in bringing up specific topics. The question is then, and probably that's what you're highlighting, that I think it's important, is that the subject I look at changes when I move between scales, right? Because when I think of what are the needs of the African women's group that are in the WIDF and they are in Dakar and Ivory Coast, they're not the same as the Union de Femmes Françaises in France, and not necessarily framed in the same way. So I think that's part of the issue I have here, that I'll try to solve it. Yes, and the tension between the national and imperial, I really hope they look more international than apparently did. I guess there is a tension there, but there is also this tension with the international, right? At a certain point, when you put the empire in the mix, it's really not clear how things goes because you have a specific difference that it's always constantly present. And it's also hard to look at the process of internationalism, not the international, but the process of it as something that is defined and smooth. I don't know if it makes sense. I think that's maybe it doesn't. But thank you. That's terrific to think about.
I'm going to quickly come in there. Sorry to use my role as chair. I mean, I have the same question as Miriam in terms of putting the Cold War glasses back on. I mean, I know that many people now want to dismiss it. And when you talk about the idea of why it's not useful, you're using Westad, which is just one book. It's one particular interpretation. And why not reach for someone like Sandrine Coates' book, in which she argues that the Cold War, the idea of dividing the world between superpowers, in a sense, broke a whole range of channels of communication, and that, in a funny way, the Cold War encouraged and intensified and thickened a whole range of international organizations, and made, in a sense, the Cold War was the golden age of international organizations, because in a sense, those organizations, the UN being one instance, but all the spin-off organizations, including the ones you're talking about, helped build bridges across continents and across areas of the world. In many ways, those international organizations, for the most part, were anti-Cold War. They're trying to overcome Cold War division. That seems to be very, very important. So I guess the question I have is that your effort, in a sense, to dismiss the Cold War as a framing model, which I think is true, but there's also an effort to talk about the relationship between the Cold War and the explosion of international organizations, which makes that possible. You could argue that in a post-Cold War world, we have far fewer international organizations because that particular effort to speak across continents is not there in the way that it was. I just want to return to one question that Sarah had said in terms of what are they organizing for? And if you can you speak a little bit about the shift from colonialism to post-colonialism? Because it sounds like there's internationalism in the sense the kind of what do you call it, connective tissue for a lot of these organizations, including these women's groups. What are they organizing for in a post-imperial context? Does it move from internationalism to nationalism? What is, in a sense, that shift across that divide? What's driving them to speak at the United Nations, wherever else? You said it's also about healthcare, women's issues, but can you mark out a shift in terms of what's that would be? I would imagine a radical shift of agenda in a post-colonial setting in terms of what does it mean to organize and why they're organizing in a way that is not the case in the colonial setting. If that makes sense.
That's thank you, Paul. No, it's interesting because yes, it's really Sandrine Scott's work. It's but also all the last year works on cultural diplomacy as a way not only of reproducing Soviet stances, but cultural diplomacy, outside of it as a way to create connection. No, that's true. I think, yeah, no, that's totally true. I'm not so sure that they are, are they explicitly doing so because of the Cold War or not? I'm not so sure. Because then when I look about these women organizations, because in a way they reproduce also Cold War networks, right? And so, for instance, there is both the idea of extending, but also if I think about the International Council of Women, well, they also have the issue that they think in national terms, but they're not so interested in extending in Yugoslavia, for instance. Well, Yugoslavia is also a tricky one, but they're not interested in trying to set up again in Socialist Republic. The non-aligned movement is really complex for them. They're not interested in Iran, for instance, whereas WIDF is. So I think they're not becoming active. I mean, I haven't found in the sources, because I can say for sure, that there is a rejection of Cold War divisions, that they have this kind of cosmopolitan approach. Doesn't mean that other organizations did not, indeed. What I've seen them say, it's really about the experience of the war. explicitly say in memoirs and other private document as well, and letters, that the issue is the war has been a moment of disruption of connection. We want to recreate.
World War II.
Yes, World War II. Pardon, yes. So sorry, I'm still in the post 45 setting in my head. But this is what I can honestly say. But I think it's interesting how they interact then with this growth of international organisms. So the UN, for sure, it's a crucial one. They all want to get a spot there, or plural, if they can. Agencies are crucial. UNESCO is crucial. I don't know if if it's about why they do it. That's a different question. But I think it's interesting. The post Cold War situation. I'm sure we do not have as many international structures. I mean, I think the issue is what is an international and what are these organizations? Because I think if the international is the representation almost equal of different nations, as in UN style General Assembly, I agree with you. If we're thinking of structures that are more flexible, and that's the issue also in finding them and recovering them, that try to create connections across spaces, maybe it's a different history. I don't know. I don't know. But how they shift from colonialism and post-colonialism, that's a good question. I mean, the liberal ones, they are extremely comfortable in continuing to proposing what they proposed before, women's education done in a certain way, they work towards community development. They're really comfortable with this. The leftist ones as well, because these countries have been colonized. So the big sense of anti-colonialism either it becomes really abstract, as in anti-imperialist, or it is also reframed, and especially on the ground by these women that are in Guinea, in Senegal, and in Cote d'Ivoire as really similar work. I think they really get involved on this. In the long term, they, for instance, take really radical stance in the process of Portuguese decolonization. And they're really radical. They literally go to Mozambique when there is armed struggle to propose support for the women's organization of Mozambique. So I think it's really, they reframe the way in which they fight for women's rights, because that's what they do in the end. Both of them in different ways. Because I don't think that the colonial ones are not interested in women's status. I think they're more interested in women's status than the colonial difference. That's where I would wage the difference. I don't know if it makes sense. I hope so.
I think that, no, thank you very much. I think we're slowly running out of time, so we'll go ahead and combine the last two questions. That's okay. I think that's Ignacio, the final question. That's all right. Yep, go ahead. I don't know your name, sorry.
My name's Sophia.
Okay.
It takes the discussion in a slightly different direction. I know your focus was on West Africa primarily, but you mentioned the heads
Yes.
and in general the overseas departments. And I was wondering if you picked up on some particular differences in how, for example, mainland French women conceptualize African women versus women from the overseas departments, and maybe if there were even differences in how African women versus women from the overseas departments consider themselves, and if they had maybe different ties to anti-colonialism or even kind of national identity.
Hold that for a second, then we'll have Ignacio for the last question.
Thanks to both. I learned a lot. So perhaps the question comes from a political scientist, so it might not make so much sense. But to me, you're treating here West Africa mostly like as a block, but there's different territories there. So I was wondering, if there are any relevant differences here in terms of like the particular networks across the different territories within French West Africa, and also in terms of like the kind of the output, what they succeeded, what they were able to achieve. So whether in particular territories certain types of networks were more successful, and that meant that they were able to have more incidents, or they were more successful in putting forward their agenda.
Thank you for the terrific. Beyond Pandora Martinique, that's actually my new question that I cannot solve. No, because really you would think that they reproduce the Communist Party style, and so that is a federation, right? In communist Martinique, La Réunion, and so on and so forth, a federation. There is no good work on Martinique. There is a really amazing book on La Réunion of Miriam Paris,
Yeah.
and there are a few articles on Martinique, but nothing that really goes into them. I haven't, I showed you the WIDF bulletin where they mentioned them because it was one of the few explicit expression of this. And actually, I don't know because whether the UFF were racist or not is still a big question in my work, because at the end of the day, that's a question. Also, how the French look at them and how different groups look at each other. What I can tell you is that I was struck by the absence of support, solidarity, positioning of African women towards other in the WIDF. The only connection I could find was Vietnamese women and Algerian women, and it's striking how each national part in the empire is disconnected from the others. Although we know that, for instance, women in Madagascar, they were nationalists and anti-colonialists, were in touch with the Union des Femmes de la Réunion. But this is a good question, and I really have no answer. I don't know if you have anyone coming from Algeria, maybe changes the setting, but it seems to me that there is quite a disconnection there. And yes, thank you. I mean, I have this regional approach that kind of makes everything French West Africa, but life is more complex. This becomes state also, and not just territories, as I call them often. Yes, there are indeed differences, local differences, which are also related to local societies and traditions and relationship of power within these local societies. And so Senegal, it's a really leftist, socialist at least, political context, whereas Côte d'Ivoire was really leftist, and then it has a U-turn at a certain point. Because the matter is maybe not ideology for this, men and women were there.
And religion, was it relevant?
Religion was
mostly
an
Muslim,
issue,
others
yes.
are more mixed.
Religion is an issue. I think when we look at the communist network, the question of religion is not brought up directly by the actors. But for instance, we know that some women that have been active in this communist network in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, are Christian, and they get out of the network and they join a Christian organization of women. So that is something that is there. It's there also in the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, because they meet with religious lay organization, actually, but still Christian lay organizations. Then obviously there is the big question of Muslim communities and groups in territories like Senegal, for instance, where Islam is like the main religion, 90% of the population. And the thing is that there is a complex exchange between the French administration and the regulation of religion, as in also engaging local leaders, so the Age that have been to the MAC, for instance, and the difficulty of communists also especially communists from France, to use religion as a leverage for that. Whereas it's used, for instance, by local leaders as also, specific forms of belonging are used. But for sure, there is a difference that needs also to be discussed more and put more into all of this. So thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Next week, we'll be looking at a panel on the EU as an international actor. So everybody's welcome, of course, to come next week. But before we do that, I want to thank Anna for really such a stimulating kind of view into her historical workshop, so to speak. And thank you so much, Natalya, for excellent comments. And thanks everybody for coming tonight.
Thank you.